My husband finally cut ties with his toxic mom and sister after they demanded we give up our house for my jobless sister-in-law and her family. My in-laws have a very toxic relationship with my spouse, and it is beginning to ruin my life. Growing up, my husband was my favorite, the golden child, and my mother-in-law was very close to him. Jacob has informed me that because his father was so busy with work, he and his mother spent a lot of time together. However, I've noticed that his sister, Sarah, is not treated equally by my mother-in-law. Although I am confident that my mother-in-law loves both of her children, I have repeatedly observed that she prioritizes my husband. I'm sure Sarah felt the same way growing up, which is why my husband has always attempted to fill the void by being a kind older brother to her and always being there for her. But the truth is, Sarah and my mother-in-law sometimes behaved in such a ridiculous manner that it crossed the line. For example, when we initially started dating, Jacob, a recent college graduate, and my in-laws, including Sarah, shared a house. My in-laws had offered Jacob a totally private room so that he could have his own space and welcome whomever he pleased. This is why he would occasionally invite me to his home to spend the night with him. However, several times in the morning, Sarah would storm into our room while we were asleep without knocking. As you may guess, we were not always properly dressed, but she would act as if everything was normal and start talking to Jacob about utterly random topics. This was very strange for me because I was uncomfortable with her seeing me in my lingerie. Before anyone points out, I absolutely understand that Jacob was living with his family at the time, so I should have expected this. But is knocking on the door before entering really that much to ask? I suppose siblings can be quite close, but Sarah and I didn't know each other very well when Jacob and I first started dating, so I thought it was really rude. Naturally, I spoke with Jacob about it and informed him that I would not be going over unless he installed a lock on his door. He agreed, but as you can guess, Sarah, who attempted to storm into the room the next morning, was successful and began ranting at us about why the door was locked. She started jiggling and hammering on the door, begging her brother to let her in. Jacob eventually let her in, and she stormed into the room, asking why he had installed the lock in the first place. When she recognized me, she pointed at me and began ranting at him, asking if it was because of this skink. I was astonished by how harsh and insulting she sounded. Jacob told Sarah that he wanted to install the door lock, so she wouldn't barge in when we were asleep, which was quite disturbing. Sarah violently flipped her head toward me and exclaimed that it was all my fault, saying that I was interfering with her and her brother. This was too much for me, as I am generally non-confrontational, so I excused myself to visit the restroom. I could hear her yelling with Jacob, who was trying to calm her down. When she eventually left, Jacob came in to comfort me. He apologized for her actions and informed me that he would speak with her again, so she could apologize to me as well. When I arrived the following weekend, Sarah apologized and offered me a pitiful excuse, claiming that she needed to speak with Jacob urgently and thought it would be good for me to come in. Jacob forcefully asked her not to bother us again, and she agreed sheepishly. Although this issue appeared to be resolved, it was not the only strange conduct she displayed toward Jacob. If Jacob and I disagreed on something, even something as trivial as movies, and Sarah was around, she would begin telling him that he should date someone with comparable likes, implying that we were unsuitable for each other. Jacob would give her a condemning look, but she would simply smirk. Another episode was when Sarah asked me awkward questions about my background in an attempt to delve into my life. Jacob and I had been open about our past from the beginning, but I didn't feel comfortable addressing it with his sister. Regardless of my thoughts, she would ask me questions like, "Why did your ex break up with you? Were you not suitable for him?" And make remarks like, "My brother's previous girlfriend was far more attractive than you." All of these queries and comments arose when she and I were alone. I began to suspect that she was trying to play a game with me, bringing me down. I initially kept my lips shut, but as the situation progressed, I had enough. One day, I responded to her taunting by stating I liked my ex-boyfriend's family better than Jacob's because he didn't have nosy, overbearing family members. Sarah was taken aback by my reply, which temporarily silenced her. Even though Sarah had a strange relationship with my husband, my mother-in-law was no exception. When I first entered Jacob's life, my mother-in-law ignored me. But once she discovered we were serious, she began acting as if I was attempting to steal her son away. She would purposefully ignore me at dinners and family gatherings, as if I didn't exist. Jacob saw this occasionally and tried to talk to her, but she never changed. My mother-in-law once referred to me as stuck-up and spoiled just because my parents put me in private school while she was a public school teacher. I also know she tried to talk Jacob out of marrying me, telling him he should look for a better spouse. Fortunately, my spouse did not care about her view and proposed to me. Nonetheless, my mother-in-law and Sarah were shocked to learn that Jacob had proposed. Both contacted me, telling me that it was a horrible decision and that because Jacob wouldn't listen to them, I should quit the relationship and return the ring. I found this quite strange and declined, stating that they were crossing a line by asking me to do something like that when I loved Jacob and wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. When they realized they couldn't persuade me, my mother-in-law reluctantly changed her mind, telling me that I should strive to be the best wife for him and care for him in the same manner she had for years. I was rather offended, but I try not to take her remarks too seriously. Sarah, on the other hand, accused me of being a gold digger and claimed her brother deserved someone with higher status. She even threatened to expose me before our wedding so Jacob would not marry me. Following this conversation, I immediately spoke with Jacob about everything. He was taken aback by how disrespectful they were towards me. He challenged them, but my mother-in-law and Sarah continued to believe that I was unsuitable for him. Jacob told me to disregard them, assuring me that he loved me regardless of their opinions. Despite his reassuring remarks, I felt horrible that his own family would not embrace me. Jacob and I had already chosen to pay for our wedding ourselves, so when my mother-in-law offered to cover half of the cost, we politely declined. Jacob explained how hard we had worked to save money specifically for this occasion. Instead of being happy for us, she became even angrier and started telling Jacob how sad she was that he no longer needed her. However, Jacob's father appeared to be quite pleased with us. Unlike his sister and mother, his father was very calm and never had any issues with our relationship. Since my mother-in-law continued to complain to Jacob, we made a compromise by telling her that we would love for her to organize the rehearsal dinner for us. She agreed, and we appreciated her generosity. However, when the wedding approached, events took an unexpected turn. The first instance came when Sarah invited herself to join us for supper, telling Jacob how much she missed him. Jacob and I were living on our own following our engagement, so we assumed she genuinely wanted to spend time with her brother. We agreed, and Jacob asked me directly if I was comfortable with having supper with her. I reluctantly consented, not wanting to be rude to my soon-to-be sister-in-law. While we were enjoying our dinner, Sarah abruptly began discussing how much she despised cheating partners, claiming that cheaters were nothing but useless pieces of trash. We stared at her, curious about where she was headed with this. Then, out of nowhere, she looked me directly in the eyes and asked how it felt to be a useless piece of trash. My brow furrowed in perplexity as Sarah began to rant, accusing me of having an affair with my coworker, Zach. Jacob, equally perplexed, asked her what she meant by that. Sarah proudly pulled out photos of me and one of my coworkers, waving them around and claiming that she had caught me red-handed. I knew I'd never been unfaithful to Jacob, so I was curious as to why she assumed I was having an affair. Looking through the photos, they appeared to be entirely innocent. It's true that Zach and I were close coworkers, but only because we started at the same time and helped each other out when we made mistakes, so our manager wouldn't criticize us. Zach even had a girlfriend, which Jacob knew about. I don't have a lock on my phone, and I've always been open with Jacob about all of my colleagues. Sarah had turned these pleasant moments, captured in photographs, into something they were not. Evidence of a fictitious affair. In truth, they were far from it. Her false accusations irritated me, as it was obvious she was trying to damage my reputation and disrupt my connection with Jacob. Before I could defend myself, Jacob, stunned and plainly upset, moved in to help. He questioned Sarah, asking why she was following me around and photographing me with my coworkers in public places without their permission. When Sarah heard this, she began rationalizing her behavior, claiming she simply wanted to investigate me because I was not of their status, and she was scared I was marrying Jacob to steal his money. Jacob told her unequivocally that her charges were false and that she was creating extra drama out of nothing. He tried to reason with her, telling her to stop spreading lies and attempting to destroy our relationship, but Sarah insisted that Jacob open his eyes to the supposed affair that was going on. I also tried to clarify that we were only co-workers, but Sarah insisted on her charges. As her accusations grew more serious, the environment became strained. I had had enough and informed her that I was going to file a police report against her for illegally photographing and stalking me. Her look grew terrified as she asked whether I was serious. I informed her I had all of the evidence, that she had purposely tracked me and taken these images without my permission, attempting to slander me with ludicrous lies. Sarah stared at Jacob and then back at me, arguing that she did everything to protect her brother and that it wasn't a big deal. She began imploring Jacob to speak with me, worried that if I filed a complaint, it would jeopardize her career and future. I firmly told her that she could only save herself at this point. Sarah inquired what I wanted, and I assured her I wouldn't pursue the complaint if she kept away from my life. Sarah had no other option for escaping the situation. At that point, she looked to her brother for support, but Jacob defended me, telling her that she should be grateful I was willing to let it go, because what she had done was clearly wrong. Sarah reluctantly agreed to stay away from me, and we have not spoken since that day. Jacob still has a relationship with her, but she has never spoken to me again. The second incident. The second incident occurred shortly before our wedding, at the rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law, who had insisted on planning the meal, rebuffed our offer of assistance in any manner. She told us that she would take care of everything. However, when we arrived, it was evident that the preparations were far from what we had anticipated. The rehearsal dinner had plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cheap Mexican food. My mother-in-law was upset throughout dinner, which marred the festive atmosphere. She drank excessively and began behaving inappropriately with the guests, repeatedly stating how she couldn't wait for the wedding to end and how stressful it had been, despite the fact that she had neither contributed monetarily nor assisted with the planning. Eventually, my father-in-law became irate and escorted her away. Sarah attempted to excuse her mother's actions, but my father-in-law refused to listen. As you might guess, the entire affair was a fiasco, and I began to worry that both my mother-in-law and Sarah would try to wreck the wedding. The next day, Jacob and I had our first disagreement. I informed him strongly that he needed to uninvite Sarah and his mother because, based on their actions, they would surely try to overshadow us at the wedding. My husband angrily protested, promising me that his father would be present and would not allow them to get away with it. Frustrated, I promised that if he didn't uninvite them, there would be no wedding. The following day, Jacob was plainly taken aback by my demand, and even though I knew how extreme I sounded, I was genuinely concerned about what they might do. I didn't want to be embarrassed again in front of my family and friends on our wedding day. Jacob definitely lacked firm boundaries, but I hoped this ultimatum would make him realize how much his family was interfering with our relationship. Thankfully, Jacob understood and made the proper decision. He called his father early in the morning to inform him that his mother and sister were uninvited. Phil didn't appear startled and promised Jacob that he'd make sure my mother-in-law and Sarah wouldn't show up unexpectedly. Shortly after our chat with Phil, my mother-in-law and Sarah began contacting Jacob constantly, apparently trying to persuade him to let them attend the wedding. However, Jacob forcefully told them that he did not feel comfortable having them there because of how they had treated me throughout our relationship. Hearing this, my mother-in-law began accusing me of being a terrible influence and interfering with her relationship with her son. Sarah attempted to argue with him, but Jacob was certain in his decision. I felt horrible that Phil couldn't attend our wedding because of his wife and children. I even felt sorry about issuing the ultimatum, but all my remorse vanished when I discovered from some of Jacob's cousins that Sarah and my mother-in-law had intended to wear white dresses to our wedding. The cousins informed me that, in their family WhatsApp group, which only had female members, Sarah had encouraged the others to wear white as well, stating there was no reason for the bride to be the only one wearing it. I was astounded by how low they would go just to hurt me. After knowing this, I was relieved they hadn't been invited. Jacob missed his family, but he could see where I was coming from. Overall, we had a lovely wedding, and no one tried to outdo us. Since that day, my mother-in-law and Sarah have stopped talking to me entirely, which I am absolutely okay with. They only invited Jacob around for dinner or special events, which didn't bother me at all. Phil, on the other hand, was always kind to me, and we stayed in touch over the years. Jacob and I painstakingly saved money and finally purchased a new home this year. It was our first home, and we were overjoyed to own something so meaningful. Jacob's parents and Sarah did come to visit for a modest housewarming celebration, but I went to see my parents and spent time with my family instead. Now to the major point. My mother-in-law contacted me unexpectedly last month. This was really surprising because my mom and I hadn't spoken since the day I married Jacob. Surprisingly, she casually inquired about my well-being and life circumstances. I was taken aback by her unexpected interest, but responded pleasantly. Then she questioned how it felt to live in such a spacious house with only Jacob and myself. Her remark stung, since Jacob and I had been trying to conceive for a long time, but had been unable to do so due to infertility concerns. Jacob and I had mourned the thought of never having children, but we had gradually accepted it. When I first got the news, I informed Jacob that if he wanted to marry someone else and have children, he could divorce me. But Jacob had always stayed by me, assuring me that it was fine to be childless as long as we had each other. Our families were aware of this, so my mother-in-law's comment was very painful. She then told me Sarah was pregnant again. I was astonished, as this would be her sixth child. Jacob had told me how her husband was unemployed and didn't believe in using contraception, which had led to these accidental pregnancies. Sarah's boyfriend was the embodiment of laziness, doing nothing around the house to help her or the kids. I've heard from Jacob that he treats Sarah like a personal maid. He never pays any bills in the house. Sarah works many part-time jobs, while he spends the entire day gaming. Regardless of how much everyone has talked to her, Sarah never breaks up with him. My mother-in-law then went on to add that, because Sarah could no longer afford to work during her pregnancy, she thought Jacob and I should give up our apartment because it was too big for a childless couple like us. I was caught off guard by her demand and struggled to find words. I asked if she was joking, but my mother-in-law responded that she was serious, that Sarah and her husband deserved to live in a larger house. However, because she did not have enough space in her own home to accommodate them, she invited them to come live with us. The weight of her words hung in the air as I fought to keep my composure in the midst of the emotional storm. I emphasized to her that this was our house, which we were still paying for, and the idea of someone else moving in without our permission was intrusive and ludicrous. However, my mother-in-law said that she had already spoken with Jacob, who had allegedly consented to this. This was strange because Jacob and I were always open with each other, and I knew he would have told me if he had agreed to let his sister and her family stay with us. I firmly told my mother-in-law that because the house belonged to both me and Jacob, he couldn't grant permission without my agreement. No one was allowed to reside here unless both of us agreed. To reach a solution, I told her that I would be pleased to accommodate Sarah and her husband for a few days if they wished, but they could not stay permanently. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, began yelling, arguing that, as a responsible daughter-in-law, I was required to make room for Sarah and her husband. She also assured me that if I complied with her demands, all previous troubles would be forgiven. Enraged, I cynically said, "Sure, I'll be pleased to let them take our place. But you see, we're still paying for it, and I'm confident that if Sarah and her husband move in, they will not assist with the mortgage or bills. So, how about you take some responsibility and contribute to their living expenses? I'd be grateful if you could just cover the mortgage, and we'll manage the rest. Of course, with only one job, you'll definitely need a second one to cover the home payments. Please let me know when you intend to get that second job." Hearing this, my mother-in-law exploded in anger, shouting and voicing her dissatisfaction. She said it was crazy of me to want her to pay the mortgage. I responded that it was equally ridiculous for her to expect us to care for Sarah's family and allow them to move in. This infuriated her even more, and she continued to yell while I remained calm. I smiled with satisfaction as she eventually disconnected the call, realizing I wouldn't give in to her demands. Soon after, Sarah called and yelled at me for daring to ask her mother to pay our mortgage. She went on to add that she had always known I was a gold digger. I informed her that she was the real gold digger, trying to live with us without contributing. I added that if she wanted to know who the true gold digger was, she could look at her own partner, who did nothing to assist her. This seemed to silence her. I firmly told Sarah that she could argue with me all she wanted, but I would never let her family into our home unless they agreed to help with the mortgage. She accused me of being cruel and putting money before family. The tables had turned, and I was relieved at the thought of sticking up for myself and refusing to back down, taking control of my home. However, I do feel a little awful thinking about my ex-husband. I'm here on Reddit wondering if what I've done makes me the villain. Update 1. Thank you to everyone who has expressed their support. To answer the most crucial question that everyone keeps asking, why would my mother-in-law demand such a ridiculous thing of us? It's because she has always been so entitled. Clearly, my husband has tolerated this behavior for far too long, and he and I need to sit down and have a serious discussion about it. It's heartbreaking how my mother-in-law can lie about her own son just to get her way. My sister-in-law is just a pawn in her game, doing whatever her mother wants because my mother-in-law has always favored my husband. Sarah simply listens to whatever her mother says, hoping to garner favor as well. In this situation, Sarah stood to benefit because she could rely on us to pay her expenses and care for her children while her lazy husband did nothing. I'm waiting for my spouse to return from his business trip, so we can discuss it. I don't want to discuss this over the phone, as it's too important. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update. As I indicated earlier, I was waiting for my husband to return. When he came back, we finally sat down and talked. I told him how his mother had called and demanded that we give up our house for his sister and her family. Jacob was definitely taken aback, so I gave him the full story. He subsequently said that he had no idea about any of this before his trip. His mother had only told him that Sarah was pregnant. That's all he knew about the situation. He had no idea his mother would make such unreasonable demands. I informed him firmly that I expected him to speak with his mother and handle the situation because I couldn't bear his family anymore. He agreed. Jacob confronted his mother and questioned why she had lied to me about him. When caught red-handed, my mother-in-law tried to backtrack, claiming that she hadn't actually lied. She said that she knew Jacob would have no objections to his sister staying with us, so she took matters into her own hands and approached me personally. Jacob stopped her, questioning why she thought he would be fine with Sarah and her entire family moving in. My mother-in-law explained that because Jacob and Sarah were close, he would naturally want to support her by allowing her family to stay with us. Hearing this, I closed my eyes in disgust but remained silent, allowing Jacob to handle his mother. Jacob then firmly told her that he was not going to let Sarah, her unemployed husband, and their 6 children move in with us. He also stated that she had no authority to force us to take care of them. My mother-in-law started yelling, stating that Sarah desperately needed aid at this time. Jacob informed her that it was not our responsibility and, if she wanted to help, she could take care of Sarah herself. She then said that Phil didn't want them in their small house, but we lived in a larger house, so we could easily help. She even had the audacity to suggest that, since I was childless, assisting Sarah's children would make me feel fulfilled. My eyes widened in surprise, but for the first time, I noticed Jacob's face shift color. He raged at his mother, telling her she had no right to say such rude things about me or try to use them to force me to care for Sarah's children. Jacob went on to say that Phil didn't want anything to do with Sarah anymore, not since she had become a childbearing machine, and that he was done with both of them. My mother-in-law tried to backtrack, but Jacob wouldn't let her. He told her he had done his best to maintain a positive relationship with them, despite their repeated disrespect toward me, but he couldn't take it anymore. My mother-in-law begged him to reconsider, but Jacob stood firm. He assured her that this was our home, that I was his wife, and that anyone who offended me disrespected him as well. They did not deserve to be part of his life anymore. Jacob ended the call with those final words. Since then, he has not spoken to Sarah or his mother. Phil later called Jacob to discuss everything. After hearing the full story, he understood why Jacob had made such a severe decision. Phil even apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I reassured him it wasn't his responsibility. Update 3. It's been an interesting 2 weeks. A lot of people suggested I install cameras around our house in case my mother-in-law and Sarah showed up to cause a scene. So I bought several cameras and set them up. As luck would have it, they showed up last weekend, banging on my door while I was alone at home. When I saw them through the camera feed, I immediately called Jacob, who told me he was on his way. I answered the door to find my mother-in-law and Sarah, both furious. They demanded that I let them in, but I refused. I told them that if they had anything to say, they could do so from the outside. My mother-in-law began ranting, accusing me of being callous, greedy, and selfish. I calmly reminded her that this was our home, and they had no right to enter uninvited. She continued her tirade, unaware that the cameras were recording every moment. I reminded her of our previous conversation, emphasizing that I would not give up our house for Sarah and her family. If they had anything else to say, they could wait for Jacob's return. Sarah then started yelling, accusing me of breaking up the family for no reason, calling me a gold digger, and claiming I was trying to steal her brother away from them. I informed them that everything they said was being recorded, and I would use the footage to file a restraining order if necessary. Their eyes widened in surprise as my mother-in-law exclaimed, "You wouldn't dare." I smirked and told her that if they didn't leave immediately, they would be served with a legal notice very soon. This worried them, and Sarah tried to downplay the situation, claiming I was overreacting and that it wasn't a big deal. Fortunately, Jacob arrived just then. He casually approached them and asked what they were doing. My mother-in-law rushed to hug him, but he resisted, demanding to know why they had shown up. Sarah claimed that I was trying to control his life by separating him from them and that they had come to confront me. Jacob reiterated that it was his decision to cut ties with them and that he didn't want anything to do with either of them. My mother-in-law begged for forgiveness, but Jacob simply told them to leave the property, or he'd call the cops. They were visibly stunned, clearly not expecting this reaction. Jacob continued, saying that if they ever showed up at our house again, we would contact the police and have them removed by force. They fled, devastated, but Jacob no longer cared. I was relieved that my husband had finally stood up for me. Jacob hasn't spoken with Phil, who was just as surprised as we were that my mother-in-law and Sarah had gone behind his back to show up uninvited. Phil agreed that we were right not to let them in and expressed his disgust at their behavior. With Jacob being so firm about kicking them out, I doubt they'll dare to return to our property. If they do, I'll contact a lawyer immediately. I'm relieved that my husband has finally seen how toxic his family is, and I hope this is my final update. I'm ready to move on from this situation and continue our lives peacefully. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.